This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 24 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, I'm going to talk about 5 common teaching practices I am kicking to the curb. You know, we're all doing the best we can. Every teacher. We are using some things that we've picked up from other people, and sometimes we read methodology books and we try stuff out there. Other times we're told to teach certain things in a certain way. But some of us, actually I'd say all of us, have some teaching practices that we use just sort of because it's the way we were taught and we don't even think about it. We just sort of do things because that's just what you do in this situation. And so what I'm hoping to do with this episode is point out some of those things that a whole lot of teachers do just almost by habit, but they actually have no basis in research. And some of them are actually kind of harmful to students or to learning. So these are 5 things that a lot of teachers do on a regular basis that they probably shouldn't do. And before I start talking about each of them, I will admit that I have used every single one of these. Some of them I used a lot when I was in the classroom. And it's one of those things where if you know better, you do better. So now that I know a little bit more about the research behind these, I would avoid them in the future. But I'm going to talk about why I used each one of them. And for each one also, we will be talking about what you could and should do instead of using these. So I do not want to leave you empty-handed. For some of these, they're such common practices that if a teacher is told that they really shouldn't be doing it, their first answer would be, what am I supposed to do instead? So I'm going to be giving you replacements for all of these too. Okay, the first one is popcorn reading. Another word for popcorn reading is round robin reading. This is something you see in language arts classes, but you also see it in history, social studies classes, or any class really where you have a textbook chapter to read or a novel to read or anything, any kind of a text that students need to read. And what many teachers will do, and I did this also, is just have students take turns reading it out loud. Just go one after the other around the room, and before you know it, you're done, quote unquote, with the reading. What I learned is that the term popcorn actually came from, I think in some cases, teachers use this strategy by having the student complete their reading and then the student says the word popcorn and then Mary, like they'll name the next kid that has to go after them. I always thought popcorn came from the idea that, you know, sort of when you see these kids reading one after the other around the room, it's sort of like a pan full of popcorn popping all around in different places. Anyway, I didn't realize that was the reason for the name. The kids actually said popcorn. But anyway, that is what popcorn reading is, and a lot of people know it as round robin reading. When I did it, my main I actually had a lot of reasons for doing it. One was that it used up class time. And this is something I'm not proud to admit, but there were times when, you know, I just wanted to get through the class. And instead of trying to come up with something creative and really engaging and maybe something that would have been more instructionally challenging, I just wanted to fill class time. So, popcorn reading. Another was that it kept students under control. It kept the room very peaceful and controlled. And unlike a lot of hands-on group work, when you have everybody sitting in their seats reading, you have a very well-managed classroom. It is definitely not necessarily good for the students, but that is another reason why I employed this strategy sometimes. Another reason was that it covered the material. If everybody in the room is reading the text, then you're getting through the text. Even though some students may not have been reading more than just their individual paragraph, at least it had the look and feel of everybody reading the text. And one more rationale was that it allowed me to listen to my students reading and sort of determine who was struggling with reading and who was doing just fine. It's almost just a little diagnostic tool. Okay, but here's what the research says about this strategy. And this is how I phrased it in the blog post that I wrote about this. If the internet was a yard and articles that criticize popcorn reading were dog poop, your shoes would be a mess. There is a ton of stuff out there that is just really dogging popcorn reading and round robin reading. And I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. It's hard to not find stuff that says that this is a bad strategy. The main criticism of it is that for the amount of time it uses up in class, your students are not getting anything out of it. It's not really doing anything to boost comprehension. It's really limiting each child's actual opportunity to read, since they only get this short window of time to participate. Kids can pick up bad reading habits from listening to each other read instead of listening to like the teacher reading. And it embarrasses kids who are less able readers. This puts them on display for everybody else to listen to their flaws as readers. I know that when I was a student, I couldn't stand it. I hated it when we would go around the room and read something, because I have trouble understanding stuff when I am just listening to it. I have to really see it, and I can't really do both at the same time. I can't read a text and have somebody reading it. I need quiet to really understand. So as a student, anytime we did this type of reading, I would immediately think, well, I'm just going to tune out and I'm going to take it home and read it myself, because I know I'm not going to understand it that well. However, knowing that, I still did it as a teacher. I definitely didn't do it a lot, but I definitely did do it. So here's what we should be doing instead. I'm going to break you up into two different groups. If your goal is with younger kids to actually build their fluency as readers, there's a ton of other stuff that you can do. I'm just going to give you a couple of options. And then if you go to this full article, there are links to other places where you can find alternatives. If you just go to cultofpedagogy.com, click on podcasts, and go to episode 24, that'll take you straight to this article with all of the links. But some alternatives, if you're trying to build children's fluency, is to actually do a teacher read aloud for the kids to follow in the book while you're reading sections out loud. They're hearing proper pacing and expression and intonations. This solves the problem of them hearing other poorer readers reading. You can also do something that's a choral reading, which I'm not a primary teacher, so I didn't realize that this was something that was effective, but it's actually recommended by quite a few of the people that write about the problem with popcorn reading. So where maybe the teacher would read a section and then the students would all read it again in unison, imitating the teacher's pacing. There's another method that is called FORI, Fluency-Oriented Reading Instruction, which is almost kind of a whole, like a program, where the students do some echo reading back and forth with the teacher. They do some choral reading. They do some partner reading, and sometimes, some silent reading. It's almost like a mix of a lot of different ways of attacking the same text over time. And I can't give all the details on that, but there is a link to that also, and different variations on it. If you are working with older kids and you're really just trying to get them to comprehend challenging text, if you think about in real life, how often does a person have a text plus 20 of their peers sitting around in a circle where everybody's going to take a turn reading it out loud? It's just not something that everyone does. What we eventually want our students to be able to do is sit down with difficult text and read it quietly to themselves. So we need to give them practice doing that. Now, there's a lot of ways, though, that we can scaffold that for them. We can give them something called an anticipation guide, where they sort of consider some of the points that are going to be coming up in the reading, and they check sort of agree or disagree to some of these statements. And then when they go into the text, they will learn a little bit more and see if their predictions were actually play out in the text. You can do a KWL chart. Know, want to know, and learned, which is a way of mapping out kind of what they already know about the topic that's going to be in the reading, what things they're wondering about, and then they go back into the chart later and complete it as they are learning things. So it gives the students a more targeted way of approaching the text. Another strategy for helping students build their proficiency with silent reading is to have them do reciprocal teaching, where they work in pairs and they trade off the role of being the teacher who sort of asks questions to determine a person's comprehension or the other student's comprehension, asking the student to summarize something that they just read, and then the students take turns back and forth sort of talking about the text as they read it. But this gives each student much, much more interaction with that text as opposed to just sitting and listening to their peers read it for the full hour of class. Okay, so that first strategy is popcorn reading. The next one is the practice of giving students prepared notes. Now, this is definitely something I did, and I did it not too long ago, actually, when I worked with college students. And it's becoming a very, very common practice where you will deliver some sort of a lecture. A lot of times it's through PowerPoint. And instead of having students take notes, you just give them notes. Either give them a printout of all the PowerPoint slides. What I did a lot of times was take the text from my PowerPoint slides and actually create an outline out of that and give that to my students. And the thinking was, well, I would rather them listen to me and be able to ask questions and have discussions than just be sitting there trying to copy everything down. Also, it was great for students who were absent. If they were absent, I could just say the PowerPoint's online, go and look at that. So it turns out there are actually a lot of problems with doing this. It didn't really occur to me until I read a book this summer called Make It Stick. And if you have been listening to the podcast for a little while, you will recall episode 21 where I interviewed the author of Make It Stick, or one of the authors, Peter Brown. So if what I'm about to say interests you, you should go back to episode 21 and listen to that. So this summer I read a book called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning, and it just talks about a lot of the things that we do as teachers and as learners that are really counterproductive to real learning that lasts. And one of the concepts that they talk about in this book is how if learning is way too easy, or if the process of taking information in is too easy, then that knowledge just doesn't really stay with us. And one example that they used is the idea of a student just reading information versus actually taking it and trying to convert it into their own words in writing or even speaking, just saying it and summarizing it in their own words. It's a process in our brains called generation, where you have to actually generate a new form of the knowledge. Doing that really solidifies the concept in your long-term memory much, much better than just being exposed to it. So by giving my students notes ahead of time that were pre-made for them, all they had to do was just receive and receive and receive. They weren't actually doing anything with the knowledge. So they weren't learning it as well. So here's what we should do instead of giving our students pre-printed notes. We should be teaching them how to take notes. And this is so old school, and for some people that is going to be a cause for rejoicing, and for others it's going to be something that'll cause panic, because you'll think, I don't really know how to teach my kids how to take notes. It would be a slow process, and it's something that you can't necessarily hit the ground running with it. How I would do it now, if someone gave me a college class to teach, first of all, I wouldn't do quite as much lecturing, and my PowerPoints would look different because I've read a book called Presentation Zen, and I know now how not to make a big text-filled PowerPoint. But anyway, even in cases when I had to give a lecture straight off of a PowerPoint, I would actually spend some time in the first few weeks of class showing my students some different note-taking alternatives. There are a couple. There's Cornell Notes. There's the outline form. There are a few others, and I provide some links in the article about this to some resources, basically, that go over some of the different note-taking strategies. I feel it would be best, instead of insisting on one particular style of note-taking, that you expose students to a lot of different kinds, let them experiment until they get a system down that works for them. To ease them into this, what I would do is I would probably give a very, very short lecture, stopping several times to give students a chance to sort of think about what they want to write down, to discuss it with each other, to write down some notes, to compare their notes with each other. I would probably even have them turn those notes in so I could look at them and maybe give them some feedback. Here's a major point that you missed, or this here, right here, is not exactly the concept I was trying to get across. You've kind of misinterpreted it a little bit. I think there are so many really, really valuable things that you can do with just teaching students note-taking. It's not as convenient, it's not as fast as just giving them the notes, but they will learn the material better. Another thing that you can do to help them just do better at note-taking, apart from just teaching the skill of note-taking, is to provide them with a pre-lecture diagram or a graphic organizer that kind of shows the major concepts that you're going to be talking about and how they're related to each other. That sort of maps them out for them so that they understand what are the big concepts, what are the minor things, and you could even refer to that several times during your delivery of content. But some research on this strategy has shown that it really, really helps students kind of learn how to prioritize and organize the information as they're learning it if they've had this type of an advance organizer shown to them. Okay, so the first two strategies that we've talked to that deserve to be dumped are popcorn reading and giving students prepared notes. Number 3, whole class punishments. And you would think that this only applies to elementary school students, but it definitely does not, because as a middle school teacher, I did this, and I'm sure it's being used in high schools as well. So whole class punishment, pretty self-explanatory. You have some of your students misbehaving, you punish the whole class, whether it's taking away some sort of a privilege or reward or assigning everybody to do some task that's unpleasant or something, but it's punishing many for the infractions of a few. Here's how I used this one. Most of the time, I would tell my class something like this. Hey, everybody, we're going to be working on blank for the next 20 or 30 minutes, okay? This is what I want you to do. Get in groups, do this, do that. When you're finished, do this, do that. If everybody stays focused, vague, if everybody stays focused and we get everything done, it's not any big, behavior problems or whatever, then you're going to get 5 free minutes at the end of class to just talk and hang out, which was in middle school was a great reward. They went for that every time because they just wanted to socialize. So we would proceed with the activity, and then everybody would start fooling around, and I'd give them a warning, and then they'd start fooling around again, and I'd give them a warning, and then I would say, okay, that's it. Sorry, you guys just lost your 5 minutes. And, it wasn't devastating, but I think for the kids who were really trying, it was really frustrating to them. And honestly, I think the main motivation I had for using that strategy was because I used it in the hopes that I wouldn't have to use it, if that makes sense. I would threaten or I would promise some reward, hoping that everybody would comply and that everybody would go along with it so they could get the reward. And then when I had to crack down and take it away, I hoped, okay, well, next time when I say this, they're really going to put the pressure on each other and behave, because I think that the threat of whole class punishment, I think a lot of teachers use it because they want the students to do what they want them to do so that they don't have to deliver the punishment. But when a couple of kids act up and then you give the punishment to everybody, it's just really counterproductive. Now, here's the problem. When I looked for research on this, all I could find was a ton of public opinion against it, but I couldn't find a whole lot of real research that said that it doesn't work. I think for some teachers it does work. If by working you mean it, disappoints everybody, makes the misbehaving children feel remorseful, possibly. But I couldn't really find a lot of research that was just sort of talking about the impacts on it. And I would love, if anyone listening to this is aware of some, if you could go over to this blog post, and this is episode 24, and tell me about it. Send me a link and I can include it in the article. But I did find some research on collective punishment. And this was more sort of done by just general psychologists, not in terms of education. Studies on collective punishment where a group is punished for the behavior of a few found it to be, at best, ineffective, and at worst, causing more problems, causing group infighting and sometimes the opposite behavior from what the person in authority actually wanted. Group punishment can also be compared to like economic sanctions that are given in, foreign policy. When one country wants to punish another country, they will suddenly start to withhold goods and services, punishing all of the citizens of that country. And that also has been found to be ineffective. So in a way, you're sort of doing the same thing with your students. Apart from any research that might be available with this one, the reason to not do it is really just common sense. If you think about yourself as that student who's behaving, who ends up getting punished, especially if this is a practice that gets used over and over again, it can be incredibly discouraging to be a student in that class. And, for a lot of kids who are real smart, they might decide after just a few instances that it's not worth it to behave. You still get punished, so you might as well have fun and goof off, because you're going to end up having to sit and write sentences or watch everybody else at recess having fun when you can't, or basically not get recognized for your good behavior. So what should you do instead? Because a lot of teachers use it as a last resort and they need an alternative to this. Well, the first thing I would say is prevention in the first place. If you regularly have times when your whole class is misbehaving or it feels like it, that's actually symptomatic of a larger problem. And the problem could be many, many things. It could be that you have not given clear instructions on what students need to do. You haven't given them enough to do, that the work isn't challenging enough and they're finished or bored. You might actually need to build in more opportunities for interaction and movement in your lesson. If students are being required to sit still for a whole class period, they may just really get antsy and need some time to just get some energy out. It might also just be time to reestablish some guidelines and consequences. In a class where the teacher is constantly defaulting to just yelling at everybody for getting out of control, it may be that systems have not been put in place for dealing with the minor infractions when they're first happening. When you do have small disruptions, it's best to deal with them right away instead of letting them escalate. I have got a video on something called Distract the Distractor, and that worked really, really well. I'll explain it real quick in case you're not ever able to go and see that. This is just where if you have a student who's sort of talking while you're talking, instead of stopping what you're doing and calling them out or sending them out of the room or something like that, you just ask them a content-based question. So, suppose you're talking about Greece and you got a student back there talking. You can ask them something, and it's important that you ask them a question that you're pretty sure they can answer, because you're not trying to do a gotcha. You're not trying to catch them and embarrass them. You're trying to just pull them back into the conversation so that they stop doing what they're doing. So if you're talking about Greece, you can say to them, you can say, "Hey, Nicole, remind us again what the capital of Greece is." Something really simple like that. You don't say it with an attitude. You don't say it with a way of like, "Oh, look, everybody, Nicole's talking. I'm going to embarrass her." You just do it in a real matter-of-fact way so that she just answers your question, and then suddenly she's back in the conversation and she's stopped doing what she's doing. But she knows that that she's there. She's not just going to slip away and have this conversation. When things do get out of hand, another strategy that I used that helped me a lot was something I just did with a notebook. And I've got a video that demonstrates this too. If my kids were getting really out of hand, I would sit down, open up a notebook, and I would just start writing. And the first few times I did this, I was writing horrible, profane things about how much I hated teaching and hated them and hated everything. And I did it just to calm myself down. But once I got past that needing to calm down stage, sometimes I would just start writing down names in my notebook. And a lot of times they would be the names of the kids who were behaving. I would look around the room and I would be making eye contact with the kids who were basically just looking back at me going, "Yeah, I think it's out of control too." And I would be writing their names just to be sort of like a list of appreciation for me to know it's not everybody. If I could calm down for a minute and look around the room, I would realize it's actually only like 8 or 9 kids. They're spread out and they're noisy, so it feels like everybody, but there are another 20 kids or whatever, 16 kids who are just sitting and waiting. And thank goodness for them. And the longer I sat there, the more of those kids there were. And so that strategy can really give you a few minutes of buffer time to make a smarter decision instead of just doing these global punishments of everybody. In the original blog post, again, if you go to cultofpedagogy.com podcast and click episode 24, you'll go over to this article. And in the article, there are actually 2 other links to some other good blog posts by other people that give some more strategies for dealing with whole class misbehavior. So definitely take a look at those if this is an issue for you. Okay, 2 more. Number 4 is using learning styles to plan your instruction. If you were taught how to be a teacher between the years of about, 1975 to 2000. I don't know when this died, or if, I don't think it did actually, because I was in a teacher prep program as a teacher from 2008 to 2012, and we were still teaching about it. So, I guess if you're alive and you were taught how to become a teacher anytime in the last 30 years or so, you were probably taught about learning styles. The most common kind of learning styles that teachers get taught about are the auditory, visual, and kinesthetic learning styles. That some students learn best through visual means, some learn best through auditory means, and others learn best kinesthetically when they can move around or manipulate things. And we have been told that what we should do is change our teaching practices. We should first figure out which category our kids fall into, and then adjust our teaching practices accordingly. And that the theory is that if we teach these different kids differently according to their learning styles, they will learn better. So in 2008, a group of researchers set out to find research that actually supported this theory, because it was so ubiquitous. There was in every teaching textbook and in every methodology class, this learning styles thing kept coming up. Some principals were requiring their teachers to plan their whole lesson based around learning styles. And there were companies coming up with learning style diagnostic tools that they were selling to teachers that they could test the kids and label them correctly. So these researchers looked and they looked and they looked and they found nothing that actually supported this theory. So in other words, there's no research that actually supports the idea of changing your teaching style to suit a learning style of a student. This one I just found out. I just found it out again from this book, Make It Stick. It surprised me. It surprised me and then it didn't, because here's why. I've always considered myself a visual learner. And as a teacher, I always really made it a priority to make sure that I wasn't just explaining things, that I was also sort of writing them on the board so that it would sink in better. But the one thing that always got me was the kinesthetic one, because I always thought, won't all students learn things better if they have more of a hands-on experience with whatever it is? And I always remember thinking, I can't imagine that somebody's going to learn better if you just tell them something versus getting to actually do it. But I would just sort of shrug and think, well, I don't know. So the only research that these researchers were actually able to find was that even though some studies would show improved learning, so for example, a student labeled as visual would show improved learning when taught visually, but that same student would also show improved learning when they were taught kinesthetically. So it was almost like the conclusions that were reached by some of the researchers didn't necessarily point to you should teach all these kids differently. What the research does point to, and what you should do instead of spending so much time trying to diagnose which kid is which one and changing all your teaching practices, is to teach all of your students with a variety of strategies. Do stuff that's visual, do stuff that's auditory, get kids to have as many hands-on authentic experiences with the learning as possible. In the article that goes with this post, I recommend some other things. For challenging reading, providing students with text structures ahead of time so they understand how the text is going to be organized so that they can go into it with that framework in mind. I've got another blog post on culturally responsive teaching strategies that have to do with presenting your content in the form of a story, that it'll help students to remember it better if there's a sort of a narrative thread that goes with it, or some sort of a story that they can attach to why this information is relevant to them. And there are just so many other strategies that can get kids to be more active with their learning. And so by presenting the information to them through multiple pathways, you're going to reach all of your students. So using learning styles isn't necessarily something that causes damage. It's just a huge waste of time, especially the part where you're trying to divide kids up and only teach certain kids certain ways and others other ways. Just go after all of them with all of the strategies, and they will all be better off. Okay, number 5, the last one. The last teaching practice that I would like to kick to the curb is differentiating by having advanced students help struggling students. And before I get into this, I just want to say that I really don't think there's anything wrong with having kids help each other. I think collaboration is really important with kids. And I do think that if one student is strong in one area, then yes, they can certainly help kids who are struggling, and they can form great relationships that way. And there's always a novelty in being presented information by a student, then instead of it always coming from you. You can't be everywhere all at once, so it's good to have the kids help each other. I'm talking about a very specific use of this, and this is something I'm thinking about when I was teaching pre-service teachers, and they would have to design units, and they would have to indicate how they were going to differentiate in the lesson. They'd have the one lesson planned out, and then under the column that said differentiation plan, sometimes they would write, I will have the advanced kids help the struggling kids. And that was their differentiation plan. And I think that a lot of teachers, and these were pre-service teachers, but I think a lot of experienced teachers even will lean on this as a way to differentiate. And they do it because it makes sense. And when I did it because it made sense. I couldn't be everywhere. The advanced kids were done and had nothing to do, which is a huge red flag for me now. and the struggling kids needed help. So why not just pair them up? And again, I don't think that this is necessarily a bad thing to do, but it is not differentiation. And that's the part that I have a beef with. It's good for the struggling students. It's not good for the advanced students. And if that's the only thing that you're doing to differentiate for your advanced students, then you are not differentiating. Research shows that gifted and advanced students really, really benefit from being grouped together with each other. So if you're constantly spreading out your advanced students so that every single group has one, so that everybody can kind of lean on them, there's a logic to that, but you're utilizing your advanced students as a tool instead of giving them the challenge that they need. They will be way more challenged when they're grouped with each other, and then they can really, really take off. So that's one thing that you can do instead, or at least in addition to these heterogeneous groupings, you can sometimes give your advanced kids the opportunity to work with each other instead of always being in the role of the tutor or the helper. Another thing that you can do instead is to provide tiered assignments to your students, and this is TIERED. This is where a task is given to students, and there are 3 levels, and the students choose which level they feel is the most appropriate for them. The middle being sort of middle level, the lower level being a little easier and more simplified, and then there being an advanced level that's a little bit more challenging. And, students can self-select this, and you can help them, but you don't necessarily have to assign kids to tiers. If a student is always choosing a little too low and they find themselves being done early all the time, that's the time to say to them, I think you need to move up a tier the next time. And it can also vary depending on the subject area. You may have one student who's really, really good in math, and they might always be directed to that top tier in math, but when it comes to writing, they need to take a task that's a little bit on an easier tier, a more manageable tier for them. Carol Ann Tomlinson has a book called The Differentiated Classroom that actually goes over a whole bunch of other differentiation strategies. And if you have been feeling that you are kind of weak when it comes to differentiating, especially for your advanced kids, I would definitely suggest that you pick up a copy. It's called The Differentiated Classroom, and her last name is Tomlinson, Tomlinson, and she really is, I'm hoping to get her on the podcast someday because she is just at the top of the pile when it comes to differentiated instruction. She's been an expert on it for decades now. And anything she says, I pretty much take as the gold standard. One of the other suggestions that she makes for differentiating for a wide variety of students is using something called learning agendas, which I first saw when I visited a Montessori classroom. The way that they set up instruction for the kids is that each student gets a list of tasks for the week in a folder. And that child decides what order they're going to do them in, and the only requirement is that they need to be done with them by the end of the week. And so something like this would be really nice for everybody, really, if you could manage it. But then you're not always worrying about one student sitting around with nothing to do or whatever. Everyone is sort of working at their own pace on their own list of tasks, and those tasks themselves can be differentiated for each student so that it's not like everyone is trying to get through the same list. Everybody has their own individualized list. And if that sounds overwhelming, just realize that if you have 130 kids, you're not necessarily making 130 different individualized lists. You might be making 3 lists, and think of that as like a tiered thing. One set of kids will get the more manageable, smaller list, and other kids will get a bigger list. So anyway, there are a lot of different things that you can do to differentiate, and I would encourage you to do more research on it. But just know that having the advanced students helping the lower level students is not differentiation. So use it if you must, but use it to a minimum and still be working on other ways of differentiating to challenge those advanced kids. So that's all I got for you today. I would love to hear what you think about these, to know if you have listened to this and thought, I'm going to change this. One of those things is something I think I can definitely change. If you'd like to make a comment, please come over to cultopedagogy.com/pod, or you can just click on podcasts and then click on episode 24, and that'll take you to the full article. And if you'd like to read it in a more structured, formal, grammatically correct way, you can see it there. Thanks for listening and have a great day. This podcast is a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. To learn more, visit edupodcastnetwork.com.